Hello, it's April the 12th. We're at the Gilroy Library in Gilroy, California, and we're speaking to Sally Duran Armendariz. Hello, Sally.
Hello, my name's Agustina.
Go ahead and say it yourself.
My name's Agustina Duran Armendariz. However, I'm known by Sally Armendariz because when I started kindergarten and I was only 4.5 years old, the teacher decided Agustina was too Mexican. She changed it to Sally, and she would spank me every day for about 2.5 weeks until I gave up. And at the end, every member of my family called me Sally, including my parents. And when I finally graduated from Gilroy High School, my invitation says Agustina Sally Duran, because they had to put the Sally in there. So that's who I am.
So, Sally, why don't you start by telling us about your family, your parents, your grandparents, and how they ended up in Gilroy.
Okay, well, on my mother's side, my mother came to Los Angeles when she was 11 months old. And so my grandfather worked in the railroad for a very short period of time, but then they went to work in the fields. And actually, I have a picture of my grandpa in the fields right
Why don't you hold it up so we can look at it?
And his name was Maximino Villavicencio.
And where is this picture?
It says that, according to my mom, it's in Bellflower, California. And it's got the date of 1909 on it. I have a lot of these pictures.
And what do you think they're doing? What kind of work are they doing? I'm sorry, sugar beets. You were talking about the pictures of your grandfather.
Yeah, there's a picture of my grandfather in the they came over here in 1906. My great grandfather brought them.
From where?
They were from Valparaíso, Fresnillo, Zacatecas. And they came to work in the railroad, but then they stopped and started working in the fields. And that's where he worked all his life.
And what about your mom?
That's my mother. And my mother, she came when she was 11 months old.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
How about your grandmother?
My grandmother's name was Agustina Mercado. And she was a seamstress in Mexico. And she came from a fairly well-off family, but my grandpa was an indito from Mexico, so her family didn't quite like my grandpa because he was poor. So that's when his father, Uncle, decided to bring them to the United States. And my mother was 11 months old, but all the rest of her 11 siblings were all born in L.A. And they died in L.A. too, all of them.
And what kind of work did your grandfather do in L.A.?
He was a farm worker. That's why I have a picture of him.
Mm-hmm.
And then they own all kinds of property. I still have the deeds. I ended up with all the paperwork from my mother's side. And but during the Great Depression, they started migrating. And that's when they migrated. But she used to say that the first time they came to San Juan Bautista and Gilroy was in 1920. And she has some paperwork for that.
Who's she, your mother or your grandmother?
Referring to my mother.
Oh.
No, my grandmother died when my mother was 17 years old. Yep, she died in L.A. General. And so did my great-grandfather and my grandfather. They all died in the same hospital, but years apart.
So where were you?
When they were working in the fields, my mother was 15 years old, and this is in L.A., and she said it was lunchtime, so she decided to go and rest under a tree that had shade, but during that time that there was shade there, the time moved, and so the sun moved, so the sun was hitting her straight in the face, and she had fallen asleep. So when she woke up, her eyes were white. She went blind, and she was blind for 45 years.
What made her blind?
She never knew. No, they never ever found out why she went blind. But she said her eyes turned white, and so then my grandfather took her to L.A. General. And every day they would give her a shot in the pupils, where the pupils were supposed to be 100 little shots. And then finally the color came back on the pupils, but she couldn't see. And that lasted a whole year. And she said they told my grandfather that to keep bringing her back, and it would be another year, the same treatment, and she would see again. But my grandfather said he wasn't going to torture her. He wasn't going to put her through that much pain. So she used to say that her dad had sentenced her to a life of darkness because my mother, she didn't even know what we looked like. She was already 65 years old when she found out what we looked like. My brother and I, because she only had 2 children.
So when did your mother meet your dad, and when did they
Okay,
get
so
married?
during the Big Depression, that there was no work in LA and stuff, they started migrating to, like I said, up north, over here, and so they ended up in Santa Maria, in a little town called Guadalupe. And my father, he came when he was 10 months old, and he was raised in North Dakota, because my grandfather had died, so they brought them, my uncle brought them, my great uncle brought them to North Dakota, and that's where they were raised. And then when all the Great Depression happened, they started migrating to California. And both sides ended up in Santa Maria. And that's when my parents met.
And how old were they?
When they married?
No, when they met.
Let me see. She got married at 35. My mother was 30, and my father was 25. She was older than him. Because my mother told us at the end of it all, and I mean by the end of it all, after she buried her brother and her sister, the last of them was there, that she had promised my grandmother she would not marry or die until she married out both her siblings, and until both her siblings were dead, and that she had kept that promise to her mother. And she said, I'm ready to die because both my brothers are gone. But that's where they met, the men in Santa Maria. And they just migrated, but at that time there was a big labor dispute there too. And my uncle was involved in it. And there's a picture of that was before the United Farm Workers, it was in the 20s or the 30s. I have a picture, because I have all the pictures. A picture there where they're in the back of a truck and they're having huelga and stuff. But one of them got shot and died. But I know very little about that. That's all I remember.
And do you know what the strike was about? Which crop or which?
But it was in Santa Maria, so I assume it was a betabel. They used to do the betabel a lot. And that's for those that don't know what betabel is, that's sugar beets. Got it? But they did all the crops. They would go back. They would go back to Idaho to do the potato, to Montana. I forgot what they did in Montana, but they did something there too. So they just started migrating everywhere.
So how did they end up in Gilroy?
Well, my father started working in Gilroy. They came from. My mother went back to L.A. My father came up toward Gilroy in the 30s, and he started working for the Sanchez brothers, which were it was Louis, Jesus, and Vincent Sanchez. And they had they had 3 sisters, which was Mary, Carmen, and Lupe. So he started working with them, and then he ended up also working at Gentry's, because Gentry's had just opened, but he didn't like it. He wanted to work on the fields.
What is Gentry?
It's called now Gilroy Foods. It's a garlic processing plant. Yeah, and I remember in the 40s that we did all the garlic, like those shears that are right there. But the big garlic people were the Vasquezes, with Chino Vasquez and his family. They were sharecroppers with Joseph Goopser. That was before Don Christopher. Yep. And let me see. He bought the house on Wilburn Avenue at the early 40s, late 30s, and at that time Wilburn Avenue was a country. It was country. There wasn't even a bridge. There was a big creek that ran right through it. In Las Animas Park, it was just a bunch of holes. It was just like cradles. So if you go to Las Animas Park and you see all the little hills and stuff, they were actually there, and people used to live there. So when we were growing up and we'd have these big storms, the National Guard would go in there and bring the people out. And they'd go right through the creek, right through Wilburn Avenue. But that's where we all grew up. And there was 3 Duran families. It was us, and then my Uncle Elias's family, and my Aunt Jean, but she's a McCammon.
And those are all Duran families?
They're all Duran families. And actually, we had a reunion in 2006, and instead of doing a family tree like most people did, is that I did a book And it had all these pages, and there's more because I didn't read the right book. These are all direct descendants of my grandmother, and my grandmother's buried here in Gilroy. And they were all born in Gilroy, except for the last two. We have like 7 generations born in Gilroy.
Do you have anything you want to show us from the album?
Not really, other than
okay.
the house may be on Wilburn.
Okay.
Because that's 201 Wilburn Avenue. It still has the same address, but now there's a shopping center there. But that was owned by the Duranes for many, many years. And then I put, they used to love to play gallos. So I put a rooster there because eran galleros, that was their nicknames. I remember as a kid, my grandma and my uncle and my dad used to take us out to like Uvis and everywhere to the gallos who were up on Chino Vasquez's ranch on Prunedale. They were forever getting busted, but they didn't care. They loved the gallos. And then I put the colores because they were crucistas and they all followed the United Farm Workers.
Tell me about the colores.
De colores.
Tell me about
correctly. De colores. Okay? De colores is a theme song of the Cursillo movement. Okay? The Cursillo movement is part of the Catholic Church. Okay? I live my Cursillo. You only do it once in a lifetime. And that's how I met Cesar Chavez, because he was a Crucista. So when the Union first broke out, and I can show you the pictures, as you know I have them, the Father Burke took I was a teenager. Well, I was 19, so I was still in my teens. We gathered food, we went to picket, and did all kinds of things because Cesar was a Crucista, and because of the farm workers, because we were all farm workers. We grew up in Gilroy, working the fields of Gilroy. We did the garlic, we did the cucumber with the dexters, we did the cherries, the walnuts, and then in the winter months, all the families would go to do the cotton during the school year. During the school winter break, we'd all go do cotton. And Fireball.
What kinds of places would you go to? Names of towns?
Fireball, Mendota, Campo Número 3, wherever that was at, but that's what they called it, El Campo Número 3. But they were all in the valley. We went through Los Baños, but we'd never lived in Los Baños. So we had to, that's where we all picked cotton. I remember we lived in the basement of the store, which was real creepy because we weren't used to that. But all the Durans would go up there to do that.
You're talking about working in the fields. At what age are you working in the fields? These memories of working. How old were you?
Since I remember. I don't remember not working in the fields. I remember that there was a tomato field right in front of, it's on Monterey and Church Avenue, not Church Street, Gilroy, Church Avenue, which is it's considered now San Martin. And they would put us in these tomato boxes and leave us there, or they would go do the pick of tomatoes right in front, that whole field. Yeah.
So tell me about your school years.
Well, I started in good old Jordan School, and that's when they changed my name. But I also wanted to tell you that it was I think it was 1951 when I made my first Holy Communion, and that's when they put the lights downtown Gilroy. There was no lights in Gilroy. And then they announced it and told everybody, as soon as it gets dark, the lights are going to go on. So all of us, even though we were in the ranch, which is Wilburn or Leasley, and at that time Leasley was called Hot Springs Road. They changed that too. We all went out into the street and they put on the lights, and we were cheering and firecrackers and the whole works, because now we had lights in downtown Gilroy. But we also, one of the ranches that we lived on was on Davidson, where the Vasquez family lived. Both families are old-time Gilroy. And they used to tell us not to go on Fraser Lake, which was next to it, because ahí salía la Llorona. Every Mexican in Gilroy was afraid of the Llorona on Fraser Lake. They was like, you didn't act right, man, they're going to take you and leave you on Fraser Lake Road.
What's the Llorona?
The Llorona is well, let me tell you what, I actually kind of think I saw her, and I know it's going to sound crazier than crazy, But like in 1982, my husband's brother was involved in an accident in Hollister, so we went to see him. But when we were coming home, he said, let's take the shortcut, let's go on Fraser Lake. And I said, yeah, no problem. So we're coming on Fraser Lake, and then we see this lady, and she's in like a light blue standing on the side of the creek there by the bridge, a little bluer than your shirt. And she's kind of up, she's there. And then my husband said, stop, Sally. That lady needs help. And I said, no, my dad said, at midnight, La Llorona sale on Fraser Lake. And I looked at my clock on the car, and it was midnight, man. Right smack on midnight. I said, man, I pressed that gas. Whether it was a real human or not, I'll never know. But I think I saw it. So that's another story of Gilroy.
So you went to elementary at...
I went to elementary on Jordan School.
Jordan School, then?
And then from there, I went to Severance. So from Jordan School, everybody had to go in third grade over to Severance School, which is an old school. It was on 3rd and Church Street. And you never forgot that teacher. Her name was Miss Melanie. Because if she caught you speaking Spanish, and it was a lot of stairs going up to get to your classroom, and in the basement were the bathrooms. But if she caught you speaking Spanish, she'd throw you down the stairs. She would just push you down the stairs, and nobody could speak Spanish in that school. So that was my 3rd grade experience with Miss Melanie. And from there, I went to Brownell. They had just built Brownell. And from Brownell, I went to Gilroy High School, where I graduated in 1961. And I still wear my ring to remind me of all the sacrifices I went through in Gilroy schools, because some of our high school teachers used to tell us to go back to Mexico. Miss Clark always said, why don't you go back to Mexico? And I said, oh, I've never been there. And she used to tell me, well, that was your choice to be born here, And then I remember Miss Baldwin, man, she was crazy. The first day of school, she would, and this was every year because I had her for 3 years because I was going to show that lady. She would say, okay, my name is Mrs. Baldwin. You call me Miss Baldwin. You're not to call me Baldwin. You're not to call me Peach. You're not to call me teacher. My name is Miss Baldwin. And for you Mexicans, you lazy Mexicans, you think you're going to do nothing in my class, you can just get out of here right now. So I had a lot of good experiences in Gilroy schools. Yep, that's where I went, Gilroy High School. And like I said, I still carry my ring to remind me of everything I went through in the schools.
What did you do after high school?
Well, I went to Gavilan for a while, and then I got a scholarship to UCLA, so I went for 1 semester. But in those days, you just didn't leave home to go to school. So I used to cry every day for my dad to go get me. And eventually he went and got me, so that was it. And then I took some courses in paralegal and that kind of stuff. And then I got a job, and I worked for attorneys since 1967.
At what age did you stop going to school after UCLA? How old were you?
I don't even remember. That I don't remember. But
Then
when I worked in Gilroy, though, I did work at the CSO credit union that we formed through the CSO, and I also worked for ESO. I think it was ESO then. It was called that. It was a area service center. I worked there. That was a lot of fun.
Tell me about the CSO, the Community Service Organization, I think it was called.
Yeah, that's what it was called. It was just an organization, a raza, and that was another part of how we met Cesar Chavez. But I was young. I was young when all that happened. It was between the ages of like 19 to about 23, 24.
So who was involved in this CSO in Gilroy?
Yeah, it was in Gilroy. It was the same people that were in the South County Housing, the South Palp Housing. I was part of it. It was Chino Vasquez, Toby Solorzano, Berta Jaques, Louis Ledesma, some of the old timers that are not, some of them are gone and some of them just moved out of town, but they were the movers and shakers of Gilroy.
And what did they do in this CSO?
They did community stuff. They're the ones that brought the ESO, or was called the Gilroy Community Center to Gilroy. It was the same people. They're the same people that, yeah. like Chino had Trabajadores Adelante, and he started in Gilroy, and Chino and I fought over that because he wanted Trabajadores Adelante. I wanted what's now called CET, which was OIC. So we had a big battle over it, and we had a lot of fun. It was interesting being involved. I was also part of the Head Start before it was called Head Start. With Father Burke and Father McEntee, what we did is that we organized. We'd go out into the fields to get the children of the field workers who were just left in cars or sitting on the side of the field, and I would collect them. Me and some of my friends. I forgot to mention Mary Lou Aguilera. There was Anito Contreras. There was quite a few of them. And what we do, we pick up the kids and take them to Morgan Hill, because Father McEntee, who later became the head of Human Relations Commission, he let us use the buildings over there, because at that time they were getting ready to build a new Catholic church in Gilroy, and the farmers threatened that if Father Burke didn't back off of supporting the United Farm Workers and supporting the workers, that they were going to withdraw their pledges to the church. And so it was a real difficult time. And I was the first secretary for it was called Farm Workers of America before it was called the United Farm Workers in Gilroy. So that was part of what we did. We did quite a bit.
So these farm worker groups, were they part of the United Farm Workers work that Cesar was doing, or they were all separate, happening at the same time in different places?
No. They were part of the Cesar Chavez, because we had already gone. By the time that we started here in Gilroy, and then at Almendariz Vineyards, which is up in Paisinas area, by the time that started, Cesar was already going. That's why the pictures that I showed you, they had the date like right after the huelga broke out, because as soon as it happened, Father Burke got us all together and said, this is what you're going to do. And that included, Danny Morales. He worked at CET for a long time. He was part of that group. Margarito Guajardo. There was quite a few of us. He was we were called Father Burke called us the Young Christian Workers. And the whole object was that we find problems in Gilroy and that we try to resolve them for the people. And that's what we did.
Tell me more about Father Burke. Was he always here, or did he
No.
town?
Father Burke came to town, probably 1960, 61. But he was very proactive. He wanted to make sure that changes were made. He was a very liberal father. He just recently died, too. And he just started organizing the youth. He started with the youth, and then he had us spread over to the adults. And he got us into the CSO. He got us into the farm workers. He got us into the Head Start. He got us into doing. I would get catechism in the field in the labor camps. He got us to do that. So he's the one that. Actually, he's the one that started the activism in Gilroy at that time, because I was like in 61, 62 when he started. I forgot what year it was, but it was in those years that he started it. But before that, going a little further back, I remember I was 3 or 4 years old, so it was in the early 40s that Lupe and Carmen Sanchez, that I had mentioned earlier, they would go and put a little table in front of El Charrito Market, because all the Mexicans in Gilroy, all the poor Mexicans in Gilroy would go to Charrito Market because they would give them credit. So we would eat from Charrito Market during the winter months and work in the fields in the summer months to pay off Charrito Market. And that was just always going on. And anybody that lived in Gilroy can tell you that. And it was owned by La Familia Mata. Don Julio Mata owned it with his son, Pastor, in San Jose. And so Carmen and Lupe would be there, and they would be registering people to vote.
And Carmen and Lupe are women?
Yes, they are. Both of them are women. They're part of the Sanchez family, where my family started working in the fields with them.
And also, do you know Father Burke's full name?
Yeah, Ronald Burke.
You know where he came from?
San Francisco. He came from San Francisco. Well, when I met him, he came from San Francisco. And then Father McEntee, was also from the Bay Area, and his name was James McEntee. And then he left the priesthood and married a nun, Father, and also a nun from Morgan Hill, and I like Father McEntee a lot because I remember in the middle '60s there was a really bad accident in Morgan Hill, like in the Coyote area, and there was a Mexican family, and they all got killed except for 2 of the children, because they were crossing the railroad and there was no railroad crossing, and vino el tren y se los llevó. So they all died except for 2. So McEntee adopted those kids. He was still a priest when he adopted them. And I was working at CRLA then, California Rural Legal Assistance, and we did the adoption papers for him. Yep. They were very, he was a real good person. He was a beautiful human being. And he also married my husband and I. And he baptized my oldest child, Raimundo.
When did you meet your husband?
When I was in the 5th grade. Many, many years ago.
And then when did you guys get married?
1970. We got married in 1970 after he got out of state prison. Because he went away for a while.
And why did he go to state prison?
Because he was not a good boy. I think he said for doing strong arm robberies. And he always told a story, and I'm going to tell it, I don't care who gets mad. He was always real proud because they had built a new jail in San Jose, which is now the old jail, I guess. It was a new jail, and he escaped. He took one of the deputies hostage, and he escaped from county jail, and he was out for about a year before they caught him. But that's the truth. That's what happened. So he had to go back to jail for a while. After he got out, then we got married. And we were married for 43 years.
And how many kids did you have?
I had 3.
Boys, girls?
I had Raimundo Juan Armendariz, he's a boy, and then Rebecca Guadalupe Armendariz, the girl, and then Gilberto Pedro Armendariz. And I'm proud to say that they all have good Chicano names. And my daughter actually went a step further. She has a son named Tecuatli, so she went back to the Aztec name, her oldest son. And then her daughter's name is Yoletzi, which is also an Aztec name. We went back to our culture because we grew up being very proud of our culture, and I taught my kids the same thing, and now they're teaching theirs. And Raimundo's daughter is Amaya India. He goes like a Mayan Indian.
We have a few minutes left right now. I was going to ask you, will you tell me more about the 2 Sanchez sisters you talked about?
Yeah, they were very active in the Gilroy community. I can't think of anybody that was more active than Lupe. Carmen was a nun, okay? She became a nun, and then she was in there for a few years, and she got sick, and she left the nunhood. And so her and Lupe dedicated their whole life to being involved in the community. And one of the things they did in the early 60s, when Father Burke was here, and they were Crucistas too. So one of the things that they did is that when we started the South County Self-Help Housing Group, no one wanted to sell land to any poor people in Gilroy because they didn't want welfare recipients next to them. They didn't want farm workers next to them. They just couldn't find, even though the government was willing to give the funding and help, they would not sell property to the corporation to build the low-income self-help housing. And so then Lupe and Carmen, they owned some property on Murray Avenue, and they sold it like, I don't know, $1 an acre or something. So they kind of donated the property, and that's where the first low-income housings were built, and they named it after Father Burke because he's the one that started the organizations.
So what are some of the names of the streets where those houses are now?
Well, it's Willie, Burke, Kennedy, Lincoln, what's the other ones? Madison. They all named them after dumb presidents, except for Lincoln and Kennedy. They were good. Yep.